My stepmother-in-law didn't even try to hide her expression the second she saw me, and I knew, before she opened her mouth, that she'd decided my outfit was going to be tonight's entertainment. The Harborline Museum's glass and steel atrium glittered like a curated dream. Floating metal sculptures hung overhead like silver jellyfish. Sponsor logos pulsed across giant LED walls, and a champagne tower rose in the center of the room like a monument to expensive nonsense. Everyone looked polished, lacquered, and perfectly rehearsed. Men in tuxedos that cost more than my first car, women in dresses designed to shout, "I belong here," from across the room. I stood beside my husband, Evan, letting my posture do what my mouth refused to do. Stay calm, stay steady, don't give her anything. Marianne Holt drifted toward us like a ship under full sail, 58 years old and built for this kind of night. Chin lifted, smile sharp, eyes scanning for witnesses. She was flanked, as always, by Kendra and Lois, her two favorite satellites, both in their 40s, with identical hair and identical laughs, like they'd been trained to respond on cue. Marianne looked me up and down slowly, deliberately, as if she were evaluating a thrift store mannequin. And then she let out a little laugh that wasn't meant to be funny. "That's what you chose?" she said, loud enough for the cluster of donors near the champagne tower to hear. "It's cute, very affordable." The word landed with a soft cruelty, and I felt the tiny ripple it caused. Heads tilting, eyes flicking, the oxygen-sucking interest of people who loved drama as long as it wasn't aimed at them. Evan stiffened beside me, his hand tightening around mine, and I could feel his instinct kick in, the protective anger he tried so hard to keep civilized. I kept my face neutral because I'd practiced this kind of restraint for years, the kind you learn when someone in your life can turn any reaction into proof that you're too sensitive. The truth was, I'd chosen this charcoal gray jumpsuit on purpose. Clean lines, tailored waist, matte fabric that didn't beg for light, no logos, no sparkle, just structure and intention. To Marianne, intention without branding read as cheap. To anyone who understood design, it read as control. She stepped closer, close enough that her perfume, bright citrus layered over something sharp, made the air feel thinner. "Lena," she said, drawing out my name like it had lint on it. "Darling, the cameras are here, sponsors are here, and that outfit." She paused with theatrical concern, lips pursed as if she were doing me a favor. "It makes Evan look like he's funding a struggling artist." Evan inhaled sharply. Marianne, but she didn't stop. She opened her clutch and produced a black card like she was performing a magic trick, like money was the only language worth speaking. "Go upstairs to the museum boutique," she said, trying to place it into my hand. "They have something respectable, something with a designer name. Put it on my account. For the love of God, don't stand next to my stepson looking unfinished." For a fraction of a second, the irony nearly cracked my composure. Because the reason I didn't wear visible branding, the reason I avoided the kind of loud status signals Marianne worshipped, was the same reason this entire summit existed tonight. She'd spent 4 months bragging about landing the featured demonstration from Glasswing Labs, the breakthrough wearable that could detect early cardiac irregularities and alert medical staff before a crisis happened. 2 magazines had called it the most promising health tech innovation of the year. Sponsors had lined up because the founder was legendary and unreachable, a genius who refused interviews, refused photographs, refused the cult of personality everyone else chased. They called the founder Sable like it was a myth, a rumor with a lab coat. Marianne had been positively drunk on the status of it, telling anyone who would listen that she'd persuaded Sable to support her foundation, implying it was her charm and clout that made miracles happen. She had no idea that Sable wasn't a myth, wasn't a rumor, wasn't a name she could borrow for her social resume. Sable was me. And the only thing stopping me from saying it right then was the fact that tonight wasn't just a party. It was a stage, and I'd learned a long time ago that the strongest reveals weren't shouted. They were timed. I didn't take the black card. I didn't let my fingers brush it, didn't give Marianne the satisfaction of seeing me flinch or scramble. Instead, I lifted my chin and smiled, small, polite, almost warm, and I gently guided her hand back toward her clutch as if she'd simply offered me a napkin I didn't need. "That's generous," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. But I'm fine. I actually have a feeling this outfit will be remembered. For a beat, Marianne blinked like I'd spoken in another language. She wasn't used to refusal. She wasn't used to a woman who didn't need her money, her approval, her rescue plan. Then her face reassembled itself into something bright and brittle, the kind of smile that looked like glass. "Of course," she said, almost chirping, "if you insist on humiliating yourself." She swept away before Evan could say anything else. Kendra and Lois trailing behind her like synchronized shadows, and I watched them go with the detached calm of someone who'd finally stopped taking the bait. Evan turned toward me, jaw tight, the muscle jumping in his cheek the way it always did when he was trying not to explode. "What did she say?" he murmured, his voice low, protective, already ready to drag us both out the nearest exit if I gave him permission. I squeezed his fingers and lied because I loved him and because tonight required patience. "Nothing," I said lightly. "She's just being her." His eyes searched mine, full of that familiar mix of anger and worry, but he let it go the way he always did. Too kind, too hopeful that if he stayed calm long enough, Marianne would someday stop treating affection like a transaction. We moved deeper into the atrium, letting the crowd swallow us, and I let myself take in the room the way I always did when I needed to remember why I built my life the way I had. Everything here screamed curated importance. The donor wall cycling names in glossy gold fonts, the sponsor booths with sleek prototypes and smiling interns, the waiters gliding past with trays of smoked salmon crostini as if hunger itself was a branding opportunity. The air smelled like citrus perfume and expensive ambition, like everyone had bathed in the same promise of being admired. Above us, the museum's hanging art installation shimmered, thin metal ribbons twisting and catching the light, beautiful and cold, the perfect metaphor for this whole world. I'd spent years learning how to move through rooms like this without being claimed by them, without letting their rules become my rules. That was the whole point of staying anonymous. Glasswing Labs existed because I couldn't stand what innovation had become in the public eye. Less about solving problems, more about becoming a celebrity while pretending to be a savior. I'd built the company the way I designed everything. Quietly, deliberately, with the work at the center and my face nowhere near it. The first prototype had been sketched on the back of a grocery receipt at 2 a.m. when I was finishing my biomedical engineering degree and watching my dad sleep in a hospital bed, his heart monitor beeping like a metronome that controlled our lives. The nurses were incredible, but they were stretched thin, and I kept thinking, if we can measure everything else in real time, why are we still waiting for alarms after a crisis starts? That thought became obsession. Obsession became a lab bench. A lab bench became a team. And a team became a device that could quietly catch the whisper of disaster before it turned into a scream. Sable was the name I used because it was neutral, untraceable, and I needed the work to be taken seriously without the noise of gendered assumptions or media hunger. The irony was that my refusal to be seen had turned me into a myth, and myths made people like Marianne hungry. I watched her across the room now, laughing too loudly at a venture capitalist's joke, touching his arm like she'd invented charm, soaking up admiration like sunlight, and I felt something shift inside me, not rage exactly, but a clean, focused resolve. Because she wasn't just rude. She'd built a whole identity around judging people by packaging, and tonight she was about to learn, publicly, unmistakably, that the world she controlled was built on paper. The program was moving forward. I could feel it in the subtle cues, the staff adjusting microphones, the lighting techs conferring near the stage, the MC flipping through his cards. Evan leaned closer, still tense. "Are you okay?" he asked, and I looked at him, really looked, at the sincerity in his eyes, the way he loved me without requiring me to perform. I gave him a smile that held more truth than my earlier lie. "I'm okay," I said softly. "I just want you to stay close when the keynote starts." The keynote portion of the night crept closer the way a storm creeps over water. Quiet at first, then suddenly obvious in every shift of the air. Marianne climbed onto the stage to deliver her welcome like she owned the building, like the museum's glass walls had been installed just to reflect her back at herself, and the room dutifully applauded while she spoke about progress and impact, with the practiced warmth of someone who loved applause more than outcomes. "Tonight," she announced, hands lifted in a benevolent gesture, "we celebrate innovation and compassion. We celebrate the future." Cameras flashed. Sponsors leaned in. People smiled as if smiling were part of the ticket price. From where I stood with Evan near the edge of the crowd, I watched her face glow with that special kind of confidence that comes from believing your social position is permanent, and I felt my own calm sharpen into something almost clinical. The program rolled on with all the expected performances: a silent auction where people bid on private dinners and exclusive experiences they didn't really want but desperately wanted to be seen wanting, a donor leaderboard that climbed in real time on the LED wall like a stock ticker of ego, and a mid-evening toast from Evan's father, Richard, who looked uncomfortable under spotlights but did his best because he loved his wife in the tired, just resigned way some men loved hurricanes. Evan stayed close, one hand always grazing the small of my back as we moved, checking my face the way you check a window during high winds, and every so often his eyes would flick toward Marianne across the room, still simmering. I kept giving him small, reassuring looks, but inside, my mind was ticking through logistics the way it always did before a major rollout. The case on the pedestal, the firmware demo, the agreement with Harborline Health Initiative, the grant paperwork waiting in my assistant's inbox, the MC's script that I'd reviewed twice under a different email name. Everything was set. The only variable I couldn't control was Marianne, and the thing about Marianne was that she always assumed she was the one controlling. At one point, she floated past again, trailing Kendra and Lois, pausing just long enough to let her gaze rake my jumpsuit with a smirk that said, "I'm still embarrassed for you." "Try to stay out of the photos," she murmured as if offering a helpful tip. Then she drifted away toward a cluster of sponsors, already laughing before anyone else finished speaking. Evan's hand tightened, but I pressed my thumb against his knuckles, steady, steady, because I could feel the room beginning to change. The staff started herding people toward the stage area. Lights dimmed subtly, the chatter lowering the way a theater hush lowers before the curtain rises. Phones came out, screens glowing like fireflies. The MC stepped forward, voice bright and trained, and the museum's atrium became suddenly unified around one shared hunger, the promise of witnessing something exclusive. "And now," he said, pausing with the perfect amount of suspense, "the moment we've all been waiting for. Our featured demonstration from Glasswing Labs." A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. People craned their necks. Marianne, seated front row with her hands clasped like she was praying, looked radiant, as if the device on stage were a trophy she'd won through sheer social will. A sleek pedestal rose smoothly, and the small black case on top opened with a soft mechanical sigh, revealing the band, brushed titanium, translucent sensor plate, minimalist enough to look like jewelry and serious enough to look like medicine. Even from a distance, I felt that familiar pinch in my chest, the private, irrational pride I always got seeing something that once existed only as a frantic sketch become real under bright lights. "The founder of Glasswing Labs is famously private," the MC continued, letting his gaze sweep the room. "No interviews, no photos, no public appearances. But tonight, in honor of the Harborline Health Initiative, they've agreed to do something unprecedented." The crowd leaned in as one body. Marianne's eyes were wide, almost feverish, already imagining the story she'd tell later. I was there. I met them. I persuaded them. The MC smiled like he was holding a secret between his teeth. "They're here," he announced, and the room audibly gasped, the sound sharp and delighted. "And they've asked to personally fit the first unit on tonight's highest donor, plus offer a full deployment grant to the hospital system chosen by this event." The buzz became electric. Phones lifted higher. Marianne's head snapped from side to side, scanning the crowd like a predator searching for prey, desperate to spot the myth she'd been using as a social accessory. Evan's hand found mine in the darkness, his grip suddenly intense. "Lena," he whispered, sensing something he couldn't name, "what is happening?" And then the MC spoke the name that had protected me for years and was about to change everything. "So, Sable," he said into the microphone, "if you're in the room, would you please stand so we can thank you?" A spotlight clicked on, bright as truth, and began to sweep over the crowd. The spotlight moved like a slow, searching finger across the audience, and I felt the entire atrium hold its breath in a way I'd never experienced. Hundreds of people suddenly united by one question, one hunger, one collective need to witness the myth become flesh. Evan's grip was tight enough to make my bones ache, not in anger but in fear, like he was bracing for impact. "Lena," he whispered again, softer this time, as if he didn't want the room to hear him doubt reality. "What are you?" I didn't answer with words because any words would have been too small. Instead, I took one clean breath, the kind you take before you step onto ice you're not sure will hold, and I let the version of myself that had been hiding for years loosen its hold. I stood up as the light reached our row, stepping forward into it with steady legs and a quiet spine, and the spotlight stopped like it had finally found its true north. For a heartbeat, there was only confusion. Faces blank, mouths parted, eyes darting from me to the stage and back again, as if the room needed a moment to translate what it was seeing. Then the recognition began to spread, not as a single realization, but as a chain reaction. People noticed how the jumpsuit was cut, how it carried itself, how it wasn't trying to be expensive, but simply was. They noticed the same philosophy in the device on the pedestal. Minimalist, elegant, built to last, built to work. And once that connection formed, it was like a spark caught dry grass. Whispers rose fast, sharp, multiplying. "That's her? No, that can't be. Sable? Is that?" And then the whispers turned into applause, sudden and roaring, the kind of applause that doesn't ask permission. It hit the glass walls and bounced back, filling the atrium so completely I felt it vibrate in my ribs. Evan stared at me like I'd stepped out of his life and into a different universe. His mouth opened and closed once, twice, and then his expression broke into something bright and stunned and proud, like he just watched the world finally get honest about me. But I wasn't looking at the crowd. I was looking at Marianne. She was frozen in the front row, her hands still clasped, her posture still queenly, but her face was unraveling in real time. First disbelief, like her mind rejected the information as impossible. Then the horrible click of recognition, as if the memory of her word affordable replayed in her skull at full volume. Then panic, sharp and private, as she tried to reassemble her expression into something neutral while the whole room watched. I saw her lips part as if to speak, then clamp shut again, because what could she say? She had spent months using the name Sable like an accessory, bragging about landing me, and 10 minutes ago, she tried to shove a black card into my hand so I could go buy a designer name. Now the designer name was standing under a spotlight in a jumpsuit she'd sneered at. The MC recovered first. Of course he did. Men like him were built to glide over surprises. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, delight blooming in his voice, "please welcome Sable." He gestured toward the stage with an open palm, and the applause swelled again as if it could physically lift me forward. Evan leaned in, his voice trembling with something that made my throat tighten. "You did all of this, and you never said a word," he murmured, not accusing, just awed. "I wanted you to love me without the noise," I whispered back, and his eyes softened like I'd handed him the simplest truth in the world. He kissed my knuckles quickly, small, grounding, and said, "Go. This is yours." I walked toward the stage through a party sea of bodies, people turning to make meeting, phones tracking me like tiny satellites, faces lit with curiosity and sudden respect, and with every step I felt a strange shift, like the room itself was rewriting my role. When I climbed the short stairs and took the microphone, the atrium quieted again, the way a crowd quiets when it wants to believe it's witnessing something historic. I looked out at them, at the donors, the doctors, the investors, the sponsors, and I let my gaze pass over Marianne just once, not cruelly, not dramatically, but enough that she knew I hadn't forgotten a single syllable. "Thank you," I said, and my voice sounded calm in the speakers, calm enough to make me feel almost untouchable. "This initiative matters to me, for reasons that are personal, and I'm grateful to support it." The MC nodded, beaming, and somewhere in the front row, Marianne's smile twitched into place like a mask being forced onto a trembling face. I held the mic a second longer and added gently, almost warmly, "And I'm especially grateful to the people who reminded me tonight that quality doesn't need to shout." The crowd chuckled, approving, hearing a general sentiment about humility and good design. But Marianne heard the sentence land like a blade sliding between ribs, and for the first time all night, she didn't look powerful. She looked exposed. After that, the evening stopped feeling like a gala and started feeling like a weather system that had decided to form around me. The moment I stepped off the stage, the air changed. Warmer, tighter, charged with a kind of eager electricity, and the crowd that had ignored me 15 minutes earlier suddenly behaved like I was the only fixed point in the room. A cardiologist with silver hair and a badge that read Harborline Medical leaned in to ask about sensor calibration and false positives. A venture partner I recognized from tech news tried to slide his business card into my palm as if it were an offering. A woman in a sequin dress grabbed my forearm with the intimacy of someone who'd known me for years and whispered, "I've been trying to get on your wait list for months." People laughed too loudly at my small jokes. People nodded too hard at my short answers. The same mouths that had been ready to smirk at Marianne's affordable line were now working overtime to prove they'd always understood quality when they saw it. Evan stayed close, moving with me like a quiet bodyguard, smiling politely, but I could feel the heat under his composure. Anger at Marianne, pride in me, and a mild disbelief that the world could flip its opinion so fast just because a name had been attached. Every so often he'd catch my eye, and I'd see it there. "You did this. You built this." And that look mattered more to me than the applause ever could. Across the atrium, Marianne became a ghost at her own event. She tried at first. She tried to keep her queen posture, to keep shaking hands and laughing, to keep the narrative under her control, but I watched her social gravity weaken in real time. Kendra and Lois, those loyal satellites, didn't orbit so closely anymore. They drifted to safer planets. The donors who had been glued to Marianne's side like she was a magnet suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, glancing at her with that subtle, cowardly distance people use when they sense a sinking ship. She stood by the sponsor wall at one point, clutch held tight in front of her like a shield. Her smile stretched thin as paper. I saw her eyes track me from across the room, resentful, panicked, calculating, like she was trying to solve a math problem in which she just discovered she didn't understand numbers. The irony was, if she'd simply been kind, if she'd simply treated me like a person worth basic respect, she could have shared in the glow without any humiliation at all. But Marianne didn't know how to be generous without making it transactional, and tonight her transaction had failed publicly. Eventually, as the event shifted into late-night mingling and the DJ turned the music slightly louder, I found a pocket of quiet near the museum's modern art wing. The hall there was cooler, the lighting softer, the marble floors reflecting the glow from distant installations. I needed a minute to breathe without an audience. Evan followed me, threading his fingers through mine as if anchoring me to something real. "I'm still processing," he said softly, almost laughing under his breath. "Sable. My wife is Sable." I squeezed his hand, a little wave of guilt cresting again, because secrets always carry weight, even when they're meant as protection. "I didn't hide it from you," I reminded him gently. "You always knew what I was building. You just didn't know what the world called it." He nodded, eyes warm. "I knew you were brilliant," he said. "I just didn't know you were a legend." I was about to answer when I saw the reflection first. Movement behind us in the polished marble, a silhouette approaching with stiff purpose. I turned, and there she was. Marianne. Alone. No Kendra, no Lois, no entourage. Without her audience, she looked different. Still immaculate, still expensive, but thinner somehow, like the air had been sucked out of her costume. The brittle party smile was gone, replaced by something raw and trembling that I rarely saw on her face. Wounded fury. She stopped a few feet away, far enough to pretend dignity, close enough to make it an ambush. "Why didn't you tell me?" she hissed, her voice low and shaking. "You let me stand up there, looking like an idiot." Evan's posture tightened instantly, but I lifted my hand slightly, a silent request for space. I studied Marianne's face and felt something unexpected rise, not triumph, not glee, but a tired clarity. "I've been telling you," I said quietly, "for years." Her brows snapped together. "Don't be ridiculous." "Not with a name you could brag about," I continued, my voice calm as stone. "Just with who I am. with the work I do, with how I move through the world. Her jaw clenched so hard I could see it in the tendon near her ear. "You embarrassed me," she whispered, like that was the only crime that mattered. I took one slow breath and let the truth settle between us like a heavy object set down on a table. "You called my outfit cheap," I said. "But you weren't really talking about fabric, Marianne. You were talking about me." Her eyes flickered, just once, because even she couldn't deny it, and in that quiet hallway, away from cameras and applause, the reality hit harder than any public spotlight ever could. For a moment, Marianne didn't speak, and the silence between us felt thick, like velvet stretched too tight. The distant music from the atrium thumped faintly through the walls, bass and laughter and clinking glasses, reminding me that this was still her event, her kingdom, even if the crown had slipped. Her nostrils flared as if she was trying to pull oxygen through pride. "You're twisting this," she finally said, voice still low, still sharp, but not as steady as she wanted it to be. "I was trying to help you. You don't understand how these people think." I almost smiled at that, because of course she believed she was the interpreter of these people, as if the rest of us were tourists in a country she owned. "I understand exactly how they think," I said. "That's why I didn't build Glasswing as a personality brand. I didn't want to sell my face. I wanted to sell a solution." Marianne's eyes narrowed at the word solution, like it offended her that something could exist without being packaged for applause. Evan shifted at my side, silent but ready, his protective energy humming. Marianne glanced at him, then back at me, and I saw her recalculating, trying to decide whether she could bully me the way she used to, or whether the room's new understanding of me made that impossible now. "If you just told me," she insisted, desperation leaking through her anger, "I could have introduced you properly. I could have." "Used me," I finished, not harshly, just plainly. The words landed, and I watched her flinch like she'd been slapped, but it wasn't a dramatic flinch. It was the small involuntary twitch of a person hearing a truth they've avoided for years. "That's unfair," she snapped, though her eyes said something else. "Is it?" I asked quietly. "You didn't ask me once what I do." "Not really." "You asked what Evan does. You asked where we vacation. You asked what label I'm wearing. You asked if I do anything besides little projects. You've never been curious about me unless you could use the answer as social currency." Marianne's throat bobbed. Her gaze slid away, not because she was ashamed. Marianne didn't do shame easily, but because she was cornered. In the atrium, she could always hide behind laughter, behind friends, behind a well-timed toast. Here in the quiet hallway, there was no audience to charm, no applause to drown out accountability. "I didn't know," she said finally, softer, and it sounded like the closest thing to vulnerability she could manage. "You didn't want to know," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." Evan's hand found the small of my back, steady, supportive. I felt my own pulse slowing, the adrenaline draining out of me in waves. I hadn't planned a confrontation tonight. I'd planned a reveal, a donation, a grant, a mission-centered moment. But Marianne had pulled me into this corner because she needed to reframe the story in her head, needed to make herself the wounded party instead of the person who had weaponized humiliation. She drew in a breath, and the old Marianne tried to rise again, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. "So what now?" she asked, bitterness creeping back in. "You're going to tell everyone I'm a monster?" I studied her, and what I felt wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, an exhaustion that came from years of being reduced to a silhouette in her world. "No," I said. "I'm not interested in punishing you. I'm interested in not shrinking anymore." Marianne's eyes flicked up, sharp. "You think I made you shrink?" "I think you tried," I answered, and my voice stayed calm because it was easier than anger. "You tried to make me small so you could feel large, but it didn't work. It only made you blind." Her lips parted, then pressed together. Somewhere beyond the hallway, the atrium erupted into a fresh wave of laughter, and I thought about how quickly all of it would be forgotten by most of the people out there, their attention moving on to the next shiny thing. But this moment wouldn't be forgotten by Marianne. She would replay it when she put on lipstick, when she opened a designer box, when she heard the name Sable in a boardroom. "You humiliated me," she repeated weakly, as if she needed that to be true to survive the night. I stepped closer by a fraction, not aggressive, just present. "Marianne," I said softly, "I didn't humiliate you. You humiliated yourself the moment you decided it was acceptable to mock your own family for entertainment." The words hung there, heavy and unavoidable. Her eyes glittered, not with tears. Marianne would rather swallow glass than cry, but with something close to fear. Because she understood, finally, what had shifted. The room might still be her stage, but it wasn't her script anymore. I held her gaze for one last quiet beat, then turned slightly toward Evan. "Let's go," I said. And as we walked back toward the noise, I realized something that surprised me. The spotlight moment had been satisfying, yes, but the real victory was this simple internal one. I wasn't asking for permission to exist anymore. I was simply existing, fully, in my own name. When we stepped back into the atrium, the noise hit us like a wave. Bright music, overlapping laughter, the soft roar of people congratulating each other for being in the right place at the right time. And for the first time all night, it felt strangely distant, like I was watching the event through glass instead of standing inside it. People kept trying to pull me into their orbit, offering introductions and invitations and quick coffee next week. But Evan's hand stayed firm around mine, and he guided us through the crowd with the quiet authority of someone who finally understood the shape of the storm and knew how to move us safely through it. Marianne was visible again, back near the stage with her posture reassembled into something presentable, laughing a beat too late at someone's joke, nodding too hard at compliments that weren't really hers, trying to paste her reality back together with sheer willpower. But every time her eyes cut toward me, I saw it. The recalculation, the wary respect, the fear of misstepping again in front of witnesses who now had a new story to tell. I didn't linger for the victory lap. I'd given the grant, explained the device, thanked the foundation, and watched the room shift its gravity. Anything beyond that felt like feeding a hunger I didn't want to grow. Evan and I left before midnight, slipping out through the museum's side entrance into cold Seattle air that tasted like rain and relief. And once we were alone on the sidewalk, the tension finally drained out of my shoulders in one long exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding for years. Evan stopped under the streetlight, turned to me, and searched my face with that soft seriousness that always made me feel safe. "I'm not angry you kept it quiet," he said, like he'd been arguing with himself on our drive home. "I'm just stunned you carried it alone." I leaned my forehead against his for a second, letting the warmth of him steady the parts of me that were still buzzing. "I didn't want the world in our living room," I admitted. "I wanted you, not the version of me people clap for." His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, the applause from the atrium felt small compared to the sound of his breath. Of course, the press found me anyway. Mysteries always attract hunters. And within 48 hours, my inbox looked like it had been attacked by a flock of desperate birds. Interview requests, podcast invitations, conference offers, photos of me standing under the spotlight already circulating online, with captions that made me sound like a superhero instead of a woman who once cried over failed prototypes at 2 a.m. I said yes to one interview, and only one, with a medical journal that cared more about outcomes than aesthetics. And I spent the entire conversation redirecting attention back to the nurses, the doctors, the patients, the systems that needed help. Not my anonymity, not my marriage, not the dramatic reveal. The strange part was that my life didn't explode the way I'd feared. It clarified. I hired better security, tightened internal processes, drew boundaries like clean lines on a blueprint, and then I got back to work, back to the lab, back to the meetings with hospitals, back to the real purpose that had existed long before Marianne's Gala. Evan and I started declining events that were just performance, and we started investing quietly in clinics and community programs that didn't come with spotlights, which felt like returning to oxygen after breathing someone else's perfume for too long. Marianne didn't apologize, not in any complete, honest way, but she changed shape the way a person does when they realize their old weapons no longer land. 3 months later, she showed up at my office without an entourage. No clutch, no glossy laugh trailing behind her, just a stiff posture that looked like pride fighting for air. She stood in the doorway as if she expected me to tell her she didn't belong, then cleared her throat. "Lena," she said, quieter than I'd ever heard her, "I'm hosting a donor dinner for Harbor Line's expansion board. The hospital leadership will be there." I waited, letting silence do what it does best, invite the truth out. She swallowed. "I would appreciate your guidance," she added carefully, each word measured like it cost her something, "on how to present this properly." It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission, and for Marianne, that was almost the same thing. She needed what she tried to belittle. I nodded once, not because she deserved mercy, but because I deserved peace, and I opened my notebook the way I always did when I was building something real. "We'll make it about outcomes," I said, "not optics." Her shoulders eased by a fraction, and I realized the final vindication wasn't a spotlight or a standing ovation. It was this. The people who once tried to shrink me no longer got to define me, and the ones who needed me had to meet me where I stood, inside the room I built, on terms I no longer had to ask permission for. A month after Marianne came to my office, I found myself sitting across from her in a quiet, private dining room overlooking Elliott Bay, watching her rehearse kindness the way some people rehearse a speech. The donor dinner hadn't started yet. The tables were set with heavy linen and low, minimalist centerpieces. My suggestion, not hers. And the room smelled like citrus and cedar instead of the syrupy perfume Marianne usually preferred. She wore a sleek navy dress with clean tailoring and almost no jewelry, and I noticed the detail with a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness, because I could see the effort in it. She was trying to dress for substance, not spectacle, and that alone told me how deep the lesson had landed. She kept glancing at the agenda I'd drafted, tapping the paper with a manicured finger, as if she could press confidence into it. "Are you sure this is enough?" she asked, voice careful. "No big reveal? No moment?" The old Marianne would have demanded fireworks. The new one was afraid of them. I kept my tone steady. "It's a hospital expansion board, not a runway," I said. "They want numbers, outcomes, scalability, not drama." She nodded, but I could see her fighting the urge to add glitter anyway because glitter had always been her armor. When guests began arriving, Marianne stood to greet them with her practiced smile, but it was different now. Less predatory, more cautious. She introduced me not as Evan's wife, but as Lena Park, founder of Glasswing Labs. And every time she said it, she made sure to look at me for a brief second, as if checking whether she'd done it correctly. I kept my expression neutral, polite, and let my work speak the way it always had. The board members were mostly clinicians and administrators, people who wore their authority quietly, and as the evening progressed, the conversation stayed anchored where I wanted it: patient outcomes, early intervention, staffing burdens, budget realities. I watched Marianne listen more than she spoke, and that was the strangest part of all, because listening wasn't her natural language. Halfway through dinner, one of the board members, a woman with sharp eyes and a surgeon's posture, asked Marianne how she'd come to partner with Glasswing. Marianne hesitated, and for a split second I saw the old instinct rise. To take credit, to make herself the center, to turn my work into her trophy again. Her lips parted. Then she glanced at me, and something in her face tightened, like she remembered the hallway outside the modern art wing, remembered the word affordable like it was still stuck in her throat. "I didn't persuade Lena," she said finally, and the room went subtly still, people sensing the honesty in the sentence. "I was fortunate she chose to support our initiative, and I'm learning to do this properly." Her voice didn't wobble, but it carried a humility that didn't match her old persona, and I felt an unexpected flicker of respect for the effort it took to say that aloud. After dinner, when the board members had left and the staff began clearing plates, Marianne and I stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the dark water flecked with city lights. The quiet felt different than it had at the gala. No ambush, no audience, no need for either of us to perform. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said suddenly, voice low, helping me. I turned toward her, studying the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness that was still pride even when she tried to soften it. "I'm not helping you," I said gently. "I'm helping the hospitals, the patients, the nurses. You're just in the room." She exhaled, a sound that almost resembled a laugh. "That sounds like something you'd say," she murmured, and there was a faint warmth in it, an acknowledgement of me as a person, not a problem to solve or a spouse to manage. A few days later, Evan told me his father had mentioned the dinner at breakfast. Surprised by how smoothly it went. Surprised by how little Marianne had bragged afterward. "She's shaken," Evan said, watching my face carefully. "But in a way she probably needed." I thought about that for a long time. The difference between being broken and being reshaped. Marianne wasn't suddenly kind. She wasn't magically healed. She was simply aware now that the world didn't bend for her like it used to. An awareness, I was learning, could be the beginning of change, even in people who hated change. The truth was, my vindication hadn't been the applause or the headlines or the way strangers now treated me with instant reverence. My vindication was quieter, steadier, and far more permanent. I had stopped negotiating for dignity. I had built something real, and that reality had forced even the loudest people in my life to adjust their volume. And when I caught my reflection in the window, my face lit by the city, my posture relaxed, my eyes steady, I realized the best part of stepping into the spotlight was that I didn't need to live in it. I could walk out of it whenever I wanted, back into the life I'd chosen, carrying the only approval that had ever truly mattered, my own. 2 weeks after the donor dinner, Marianne called me for the first time without Evan as the excuse. No, I was just checking on my stepson. No forced sweetness. No vague invitation that was really a summons. Just my phone lighting up with her name while I was standing in my lab, watching a technician run a stress test on our newest sensor plate. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail out of habit. Old self-protection reflexes die slowly. But something in me had changed. I no longer felt the need to hide from her, and I no longer felt the need to chase her approval, either. I answered on the third ring. "Lena," she said, and her voice was clipped, controlled, as if she'd practiced saying my name without contempt. "Do you have 5 minutes?" I glanced through the glass wall at my team, then stepped into the quiet corridor outside the lab. "I do," I said. She inhaled, and I heard a faint rustle, paper, maybe, like she was gripping something to keep her hands steady. "There's an article coming out," she said, "about the Gala, about you." The way she said you carried a strange weight, not admiration, not resentment, but something closer to resignation. "I know," I replied. "They asked for comment. I declined." Silence stretched, and then she said, almost reluctantly, "They also called me." I could picture it instantly. Marianne on the phone with a journalist, trying to control the narrative, trying to decide whether to claim proximity or deny damage. "And?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated. "I told them," she said slowly, "that the event wasn't about me." I blinked, surprised despite myself. Marianne had built an entire life around making events about her. "I said the foundation was lucky to have your support," she continued, voice tight, "and that you were gracious." The last word sounded unfamiliar in her mouth. I didn't rush to praise her. Praise was a currency she'd always tried to collect. But I let the moment exist. "That was fair," I said simply. Another pause. Then, quieter, she added, "I'm trying not to be that person." I leaned my shoulder against the corridor wall and closed my eyes for half a second, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was letting the truth settle. Marianne wasn't apologizing, not fully, not cleanly, but she was acknowledging a flaw in herself, and for someone like her, that was like admitting gravity existed. "You don't have to become someone else overnight," I said. "You just have to stop hurting people to feel powerful." Her breath caught, barely audible. "Evan doesn't talk about it," she murmured, "but I know I've made his life harder." That was the closest I'd ever heard her come to the word sorry. It wasn't an apology offered on a silver tray. It was a reluctant confession slipped under the door. I didn't soften into comfort. I didn't want to teach her that pain could buy intimacy. But I also didn't sharpen into cruelty. "You can make it easier," I said, "going forward." She was quiet again, and then her voice regained a bit of its old stiffness, as if she'd gotten too close to vulnerability and needed armor back. "There's another thing," she said. "The hospital board chair, the surgeon, she wants a private meeting with you. Not at the clinic, at my house." I almost laughed, because of course Marianne still wanted the prestige of hosting, still wanted the optics of being adjacent to whatever mattered. But now I could hear something else underneath it. Anxiety. She was afraid to mishandle this, afraid to ruin something that could help people, afraid to prove she hadn't learned anything at all. Fine, I said. But we keep it small. No photographers, no special guests, just the people who need to be there. Marianne exhaled like I just granted her a fragile peace treaty. Agreed, she said quickly. Then, after another brief pause, she added, And, Lena? Yes? My hand tightened around the phone, waiting for the familiar sting. Instead, her voice came out almost subdued. Wear whatever you want. The sentence was simple, almost nothing, but it landed like a stone dropping into still water, quiet ripples spreading outward. I stared at the lab door, at the blur of my team moving behind glass, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still clenched. I always do, I said softly, and this time when she didn't have a sharp response ready, the silence between us felt different. Not warm, not close, just clearer. When I walked back into the lab, the hum of machines and the focused energy of my team wrapped around me like home. I watched the sensor test data scroll across the monitor, clean lines, steady numbers, truth in motion, and I realized how far I'd come from the woman who once endured insults just to keep peace. The spotlight had changed Marianne's perception of me, yes, but the real shift was deeper than that. I'd changed my own perception. I no longer saw myself as someone trying to survive other people's rooms. I was someone who could choose which rooms were worth entering. And when I did enter, I did it without shrinking. Life has a funny way of revealing what's real, especially when you stop trying to prove yourself to people who only respect labels. If there's one lesson in this story, it's this. Don't shrink to fit someone else's idea of what valuable looks like. Some people will judge you by packaging, your clothes, your job title, your loudness, because it's easier than doing the work of actually seeing you. You can't control their blindness, but you can control your boundaries. Keep your dignity quiet and firm. Let your work, your character, and your consistency speak over time. And when the moment comes, when truth has to step into the light, don't rush to be cruel or perform revenge. Real power isn't humiliating someone back. It's refusing to be humiliated in the first place. Stay focused on what matters, not applause. Build something solid, whether that's a skill, a relationship, or a life you're proud to wake up to. If someone only respects you once they learn your name, remember that their respect is conditional, not sincere. Choose people who love the real you, and become someone whose approval you don't have to beg for, especially your own.